Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Moa, aka Swedish Whiskey Girl, and today I thought I'd talk a bit about what Scotch is. A lot of people of course know Scotch. You might have heard of it in your favourite TV series, on films, maybe your dad drinks it, your granddad, your mother, your sister. I mean, nowadays Scotch is a drink for basically everyone, over legal drinking age of course. But technically, Scotch whiskey is whiskey from Scotland, has to be made in Scotland, has to be matured for at least 3 years in an oak cask, and it needs to be bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. That's kind of your baselines. And in this video, I'll talk a little bit more focusing on what is Scotch. I'm going to do another video focusing a bit more on the whiskey regions and a little bit more on what peat is, for example. But in this one, it's just kind of the basics. So, to start, we of course have those baselines that I just described, but you also have 5 different types of whiskey in Scotland. You have single malts, you have single grains, you have blended grains, you have blended malts, and you have blends. We usually say that single malt is 90% of the conversation. You'll hear a lot about them, a lot of people talk about them, but 90% of what is actually sold from Scotland is blended whiskies, and I'm going to explain why. Single malts, the single means that all of that whiskey is from one single distillery, but a single malt can be made from thousands of different casks as long as those casks contain the whiskey that's been made in that distillery. The malt part means that it's been made from malted barley, 100% malted barley. It's made from water and it's made from yeast. I'm also going to do another video on whiskey production to explain a little bit further about why you use those 3. But in this video, it's those 3 components that you use to make a single malt. A blended malt is when you take a single malt from one distillery, a single malt from another distillery, or 100 different single malts from different distilleries, and you blend them together. That's your blended malt. A single grain whiskey is, I know it gets a little bit tricky halfway through, but grain whiskey is either a whiskey that is made from other grains except for barley. So you can use, for example, 50% barley, and then your rest of your mash bill is maybe wheat or corn or rye, for example. If you make it 100% rye, that is also a grain whiskey. 100% wheat, that is also a grain whiskey. But generally, you need a little bit of malted barley in your mash bill to get enzymes that will kickstart the conversion from starch to sugars that you need for the yeast later on. But I'm saving that for another video. So single grain is generally also made in column still distillation, which is this massive, really tall still. You have little kind of sections, and it basically just distills again to get the spirit up to quite a high ABV. When you make single malts, you generally, or you have to use a pot still where you distill in batches. So you put the liquid through this pot still, which is basically like a big kettle, and then you collect the vapors from the top, and that goes off to be distilled once more, because you have to distill at least 2 times. And what you end up is a liquid that's around 70% ABV, but in a column still, because it distills over and over again, that will give you something that can be much higher. That's generally also a type of distillation that you use a lot for vodka, because you want it to be quite high, you want the liquid to be quite neutral, and then you of course can water it down later on. Blended grain, or before I go on to blended grain, single grain can also be 100% malted barley, but it's distilled through a column still, through that continuous distillation that just keeps going, because you just basically get the liquid in and you distill, and meanwhile you're distilling, more and more liquid is coming in, so you're continuously distilling all the time instead of doing it in batches like you would with a pot still. Blended grain is of course different grain whiskies from different distilleries, because a single grain from one distillery, blended grains is different single grains blended together. And then of course we have blends that make up the most of the production and the sales from Scotland. That is grain whiskey and single malts blended together. Most big companies will have a higher proportion of green whiskies to your single malt, so maybe 70-30 or 80-20, because green whiskey gives you more of a neutral spirit, because you distill away more of kind of the heavier compounds that you might want to retain in a single malt. But this lighter spirit is also quite good at soaking up flavors from casks as well. So you can get a really kind of light and easygoing spirit that you can top up with your single malt. So basically you have the green whiskey, which is your canvas, and then you add the paint, which is these different single malts to go in whatever direction you choose. And you of course have the different whiskey regions, the lowlands, the highlands, Speyside, Campbelltown and Islay, and they all tend to have different kind of characteristics. Islay whiskies tend to be smoky, Speyside whiskies tend to be fruity, but there's of course exceptions in all of them. The islands is another kind of interesting one. The islands that surround Scotland are part of the Highlands, except for Islay, because Islay has so many historic distilleries on it that it has its own region. But technically, the islands is not its own region, but some people choose to describe the islands in a specific way because they tend to have a similar flavour profile, you could say. I will talk more about that in the video about the regions. I don't want this video to be too long, so it's too hard to kind of listen into, but we'll stick to what is Scotch. So you have those different 5 ones, which can be really good to know if you're ordering Scotch in a bar. Because if you go up to a bartender and you go, I would like a Scotch, that is very difficult for them. Because there's so many different flavours, which is what I think is so fun about whiskey. But if you know, oh, I like a green whiskey, which is a little bit lighter sometimes, you can get quite old green whiskies for a quite good price. Because green whiskies, you can make so much of it. I think I've heard this, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, but a medium-sized grain distillery can make in a week what a single malt, like a medium-sized single malt distillery, can make in a year. So it's a big difference. You can make so much more grain whiskey in a shorter period of time. That's not saying it's worse. I really like grain whiskies personally, and like I said, you can get really old grain whiskey for a really good price if you're interested in trying something that has been in contact with oak for a longer time. That is of course one of the things in Scotland, has to be an oak cask, cannot be chestnut, cannot be any other type of wood, has to be oak. Something that differs Scotch from, for example, bourbon is of course that we can use refill casks instead of using virgin oak that they have to use, which is perfect because they can use their virgin oak casks, then they can ship them over to Scotland and we can use them again. So it's kind of a recycling of casks. You can use them a first fill, second fill, you can also use a refill, but you get to a point where the oak is so exhausted you can't get more flavour out of it. And I usually see a cask like a tea bag. So the first time you use it, get a lot of colour, a lot of flavour. The second time you use it, a little bit less colour, a little bit less flavour. And the third time you get just a tiny influence of both. I can tell this video is not going exactly as I planned because I'm kind of going into different directions. It's just because I get so excited about talking about whiskey. But another thing that is good to know is of course that you can't add anything else to your whiskey. You can't add any flavourings or anything. All of the flavours you get in whiskey is from barley, yeast and water. One thing you can add, however, and another thing that you can do is you can add caramel colouring, E150A, and you can also chill filter. Chill filtration is when you kind of cool the spirit down and then you say, for example, to explain, it's kind of like you put it through a really fine sieve and you get rid of some components. This is done because when you leave whiskey to stand or you put ice in whiskey, it will eventually go cloudy because it contains components that will have that effect. Doesn't mean that your whiskey is bad or that it's defect, it's just what happens naturally. But because cloudy whiskey is something that people would look at and be like, oh, there's something wrong with my whiskey, most people for big companies will use chill filtration. You will of course be able to tell on the bottle if it's non-chill filtered because it's something that a lot of people take pride in, so you usually can read it on the bottle if it's non-chill filtered. The same with natural colour. If it's natural colour, it tends to be on the bottle. If it is a whiskey that is sold in Germany, they have to put that it's E150 in the bottle or contains caramel colouring because of the laws in Germany. So that can be a good way to keep track of it. But if it's only for the UK, you don't have to put on the label that it contains caramel colouring. And basically adding caramel colouring is to keep the consistency of batches. Like I spoke about before with the pot still distillation, you make your whiskey in batches and then you of course mature that and you make a new batch and you put that into casks. So there can be an irregularity between the colour of the different batches because oak kind of has its own life. They can do a little bit whatever they want. Sometimes you have a warmer summer, sometimes you have a colder summer, and that can of course affect how much colour extractions you get from the casks. So generally it's just to keep the colour consistency so that people won't look at one batch and go like, this whiskey's better or that whiskey's better, because the blenders are of course supposed to be so excellent at their job that you're supposed to get the same flavour every time. And while I'm talking about colour, of course, I think most people know that a darker colour doesn't mean that the whiskey is necessarily better. Usually when you have a darker colour, you can have an older whiskey, or it could have been in, for example, a virgin oak cask or a European oak cask that tends to give you a little bit of a darker hue. Older whiskies, not necessarily better either, just depends what you like. Over time, the whiskey tends to kind of smoothen out and get more well-rounded, but of course, it depends on what you like. If you like a really, really smooth whiskey, almost to the point where the flavours just flow in together, then an older whiskey might be for you. If you like a little bit of a youthfulness, a playfulness, and aromas to kind of come out at you a little bit more like fireworks, then maybe a younger whiskey is for you. That also brings me on to talk about peat. I'm going to do a video on what peat is, but basically it's a young version of coal. If you burn the peat when you dry the barley, at the beginning of the process of making whiskey, then you have phenols, which is flavour compounds that get stuck to the barley, and they will give you a smoky character in your whiskey even after distillation. Peated whiskies can of course be an acquired taste. It doesn't have to be. For me, it was my gateway into whiskey. As a Scandinavian, it actually tends to be Scandinavians that have a really fondness for the smoky whiskies. But for me, it tasted a little bit like home, like going out, having a barbecue, having smoked meats. It was just a flavour that I recognised. So don't be afraid of smoky whiskies, but generally most people tend to start on something that's a little bit fruitier perhaps, a little bit easier going. But peaty whiskies you tend to find, of course, sometimes in the islands and sometimes on Islay, which is known for its kind of big, heavily peated whiskies, which can be absolutely wonderful. But with peated whiskies, if you're a big fan of a lot of smoke, then go for a younger whiskey. Because if you go for an older whiskey, the cask influence takes over the smoke, so it tunes down the smoke quite a lot. But if you have a younger one or a cask that is not as active, perhaps a refill casks, then you can retain more of the smoke, which of course peat heads and heavily peated fans will absolutely love. I think I've now gone through what I wanted to chat about. This is kind of the basics of what Scotch is, but I will of course try to make more videos of what peat is, what the whiskey regions are, what the differences are between Scotch and bourbon, for example, or Irish whiskey, and of course more on the history of Scotch, because it has such a long and fascinating history as well. If there's any topics that you would like to see, please put them in the comments below. I love hearing what you're interested in, of course. And if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube and my other social channels, I would be absolutely over the moon if you consider using my affiliate links with either Master of Malt, the Whisky Exchange, or the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. All the information is of course in the description here below. And the way it works is that if you buy something through the link, I get a small share, which of course helps me build my channels. And a massive thank you to everyone who's done this already. Every little really helps, and I really want to be able to build this moving forwards. As always, a massive thank you to my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Your support means so much. You guys are amazing. If you're curious about my website, my Instagram, my Patreon, or my Teespring shop where I sell whiskey merch, please have a look in the description as well. The links are all there. But I hope you all had an absolutely wonderful day and that you've enjoyed this video. Slán ba, Skål.